Can I just interrupt for one moment? I had mentioned earlier that someone had mentioned that she had a Keris dagger, and I was hoping she would be here. So I just thought it could be tabled before the talk started. So, this is Dr. Shauna's Kama, and so I would not have interrupted if it had, because I thought it was lovely to actually see the object. Yeah. I was wondering if you're allowed to touch it, because it's very mystic object, so you don't actually touch it, but at least you can see it. Yeah. So after she puts it, we could perhaps start. Yeah, and then Shaina could tell us the story at the end.
Allow me to again begin by wishing everyone a Happy New Year, and thank you for coming to the talk. My thanks to Veena, my thanks to the organizers of the event, of course, and I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about something which is actually very close to my heart. I am myself a collector of Kerises. I know this is not an edition of Antiques Roadshow, but if anyone has any more Kerises, you can take them out and we can talk about that a bit. I'd like to simply begin by telling you what I am, what I do, and why I do what I do. As Veena has alluded to earlier, one of my pet projects has always been this attempt, sustained attempt, to somehow bridge this gap between South and Southeast Asia. Prior to my current posting in Singapore, I was in Germany for 7 years. I was very happy to be in Germany because at the institute I worked in, which was the Centrum Moderne Orient, we worked on a project called the Seascape, the Indian Ocean as a seascape. And our thesis was simple. Conventional academia has always seen seas and oceans as empty spaces. And our thesis was that seas and oceans are actually connecting spaces. They are inhabited spaces. They're not just empty patches of water, but rather they are corridors that connect. And I see the Indian Ocean as a corridor that connects two chambers of the same house, South and Southeast Asia being two rooms in one big house, with the Indian Ocean as the corridor that connects us. And as Veena alluded to earlier as well, there's something very personal for me as well, simply because of my family origins. On my mother's side, we are Javanese, Dutch, Arab, and on my father's side, we came from Punjab, which of course means that I literally have feet on both sides of the Indian Ocean. So my steps are big as a result. But sadly, in the post-colonial age that we live in, I think one of the biggest problems that post-colonial states have is that our histories are post-colonial histories, and post-colonial histories prioritize the nation state as the primary actor, and the state becomes the only agent on the theater of human history. And as a result of that, the connections between peoples and cultures gets lost, and post-colonial history has always been written with the post-colonial state as the beginning and the end point of history, which means that so much of our collective common shared history is lost. And for me, this is a tragedy. I'd like to talk more about this tomorrow, in fact, when we're talking about the connection, the long historical connection between India and Southeast Asia. And my thesis has always been that foreignness, the perception of foreignness, has got nothing to do with geography. It has more to do with perceptions. If we see each other as foreign, then the person next door might as well be living in New York. But if you see someone as being close to you, then distance doesn't matter. And my belief is that it is actually the destiny of South and Southeast Asia to reconnect, because the Indian Ocean has been the thing that has connected us. There is ample material evidence to prove that this long historical connection has always been there. And it was something that was never forced. It was spontaneous, it was dynamic, it was alive, and it animated both parts of the world, South and Southeast Asia. And one thing which points to this is a continual living reminder of this long shared common history is actually the Keris. And as a political historian who works primarily on Southeast Asia, but also South Asia, I'm somewhat saddened by the developments in post-colonial Southeast Asia, simply because with the emergence of newly independent states, Malaysia, Indonesia, what we see is the development of modern post-colonial narratives. Malaysian history is only about Malaysia, Indonesian history is only about Indonesia, and so these ties that bind us have been severed one by one. And in the process of severing these ties, there's also been a process of historical erasure and deliberate collective state-induced forgetting. And one of the things that we've forgotten, particularly in Malaysia, which is the country I'll be focusing on, one of the things we've forgotten is the Hindu origins of the Keris, which is, I think, a living, real, material connection that we have not only to India, not only to South Asia, but to the Indian Ocean as a whole. So that basically is the outline of what I want to talk about today. And what I propose to offer you is basically a broad historical survey of how this object has evolved from the pre-colonial, colonial to post-colonial period, and how, interestingly enough, this object, which binds the peoples of Malaysia and Indonesia to the wider Asian region, today has become instead, sadly, a marker for not only politics, but in particular a sort of rather nasty right-wing ethno-nationalist racialized politics. So perhaps if someone could help me turn off the light and I can project this, we can... give the machine a few minutes to warm up. Beforehand, I have to warn you, I am completely useless at technology. And so this is actually my first attempt ever to work this thing. This was meant to be my first slide, but allow me to begin with the last, in fact. There you see a Keris. The man wielding it, wearing the sort of maroon red baju Melayu, I think you will recognize the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, now Tun Mahathir Mohamad. And to the left, the man wearing the slightly goldy Malay outfit is a politician by the name of Ibrahim Ali. This is a photo that was taken last year at the launch of a movement called Perkasa, which is a right-wing Malay Muslim ethno-nationalist movement, which calls itself an NGO, which has now appeared on the already overpopulated and somewhat cluttered Malaysian political scene as one of the most vocal exponents of Malay dominance in Malaysian politics. Just a short footnote here, for those of you who are not familiar with the political terrain of Malaysia. Malaysia is, of course, a former British colony, like India, like Singapore, like Burma. It is a plural country with a very diverse, ethnically diverse population, majority of whom are Malays. In 1957, when Malaya in 57, Malaysia from 1963. When Malaya became independent in 1957, the Malayan constitution states categorically that by definition, every Malay has to be a Muslim, which of course poses certain conundrums, certain problems for historians like myself, because if every Malay is necessarily a Muslim, how do we describe our ancestors who were Hindus and Buddhists prior to the colonial period? Surely they are not Japanese. So someone has to account for that. And that is one of the many dilemmas that has never really been successfully resolved or answered in the post-colonial era and the haste for development. Anyway, here, if you look at this photo, it's an interesting photo because it is the gathering of the members and leaders of the Perkasa movement, with Tun Mahathir as their, well, I wouldn't say sponsor, but perhaps not necessarily benefactor, but he was the guest of honor at this event. And you can see Mahathir actually holding up a Keris, which today has become a political emblem of the Malay Muslim majority community. I find this ironic that the Keris has become an emblem, a politically overdetermined signifier that signifies one specific ethnic religious community. Whereas what I would like to argue, and what I will be arguing, is the fact that the Keris is an overdetermined signifier that is actually rich in meaning and signification precisely because of its very, very complex past. So, as I said, this was actually meant to be the last image, but let's begin with this one, and let's proceed then. Well, Veena has alluded to the long historical connection between Southeast Asia and South Asia, and this is obviously true. Till today we see concrete evidence of this long period of shared contact. This is a lithograph from Delaporte's History of Cambodia. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with these images. These are the temples of Bayon. And of course, a part of the world that I'm particularly interested in is maritime Southeast Asia, which basically covers Indonesia, Philippines, and Peninsula and East Malaysia. And all over Indonesia, particularly Java, we still see till today living, concrete evidence of this long period of historical contact. These are perhaps some of the earliest examples. These are the temples at the Gunung Songo complex in central Java, up in the mountains. These are actually up in the mountains. The interesting thing about this temple, I use this photo often because I often lecture on comparative religion at universities in Indonesia. If you look at these temples, they are actually a complex of 9 temples. These temples are contemporaneous with the shore temple of Mamallapuram. It is interesting to note they are Shivite temples, very much like the temples that we had in South India as well. And in terms of design structure, the false second and third floor, the orientation of the temple structure, with the exception of the absence of Nandi, they are almost exactly identical to the temples we see in South India at the time. Now, this for me is very, very important. It's very important again because it emphasizes the contemporaneous development of Hinduism in Java and India at the same time. I emphasize this for one simple reason. To again refer to what Veena had mentioned earlier, I think one of the most damaging things about colonial scholarship, Orientalist scholarship, was that it created the impression that the Hinduization and the arrival of Buddhism in Southeast Asia was a one-way process, where India, in a sense, spread Hinduism and Buddhism to Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia received it passively. The fact that these temples were contemporaneous with the temples in South India would suggest that Hinduism developed parallel, in tandem. And it's interesting, if you actually were to look at the temple close up in real life, and I've been to both Mamallapuram and Gunung Songo, obviously, because I took this photograph, they are actually identical in size as well. Now, this suggests to me that there was actually a sharing of ideas, particularly when it came to architecture. If you look at the temples that were being designed in Java at the time, we see clearly that these are Javanese temples. In terms of the overall structure and design and orientation, they followed the canons of classical Hindu architecture. And these are Shivite temples. The statues inside have been removed for obvious reasons. They're now in museums. But they do suggest that in central Java and in South India, Hinduism was developing in tandem with each other, the dominant creed there being Shivite Hinduism. And temples like this dot the whole of the Indonesian archipelago till today. Across Gunung Songo, at the Dieng Plateau, also in central Java, we'll find other temples. This is the Bima Chandi, the Bima temple. we don't actually know why it's called Bhima. It's not the name. Nobody knew the name, and they've been given these arbitrary names. There's the Arjuna temple, there's a Drupadi temple, there's a Bhima temple. There's no particular reason why. It's not a temple dedicated to Bhima. But again, we see similarities in design. And the temples continued to develop all across Indonesia up to the 18th century. This is one of the youngest temples in Java. This is Candi Ceto, which is also in central Java, to the east of Surakarta, and it's very much influenced by the Balinese temples that we see. And of course, by then, Bali, by the 18th century, Bali was one of the places in the Indonesian archipelago where Hinduism flourished. Which brings us to the subject of the Keris and the origins of the Keris. Now, with the development of Hindu-Buddhist architecture all across Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, in Thailand, in Burma, obviously, in Java, in Sumatra, many other things developed. And one of the most iconic emblems of maritime Southeast Asia, and by this I mean Indonesia and Malaysia, is the fabled Keris dagger. Unfortunately, there are more fables than facts when it comes to the Keris, but I thought I'd start with this as a photo to give you an idea of what a Keris actually looks like. This is actually my personal Keris, which was given to me by my teacher from Kelantan. And you would look, if you look closely at the blade and the hilt, I'll explain the hilt later, but the blade, the top end of the blade for me is the most important part, because here is where we begin to decipher the semiotics of the Keris, and this is where we begin to decode this object. For me, reading the Keris, and that's what I do, I read the Keris as a narrative. Reading the Keris today in our modern Facebook, Wikipedia age is a bit of a challenge, simply because it's like trying to decipher the hieroglyphics without the Rosetta Stone. And the problem is, for the longest time, particularly from the 19th century onwards, a sense of historical disconnect has set in between the peoples who produce the Keris and the Keris's origins. This is particularly true in the case of Malaysia, where, for reasons that I shall elaborate later, there has been a sustained attempt to demythify, desacralize the Keris and turn it into not only a mundane object, but sadly a political object. One thing that has been lost in the process is, of course, the sacred value of the Keris. The Keris has been presented in literature, in popular fiction, as a almost mythical weapon, having this exotic status. There's even a poem by Baudelaire about the Keris, about someone who goes amok and chops off heads with a Keris. And so the Keris developed this reputation, particularly in popular fiction, colonial fiction, then as the fabled weapon of these Malays and Indonesians who were prone to going amok at the drop of a hat. In the process of it being transformed into this object of fable and myth, it lost its sacredness. And what I'm trying to do often when I talk about the Keris to my students is to reconnect the dots, so to speak, to help you decipher what the Keris really was. Let me begin with one simple thesis. The Keris is not a weapon. Those of you who are familiar with sharp-edged weapons and cutting and slashing weapons will know one very simple thing. Anyone who's handled a weapon before, a cutting or slashing weapon, will know one very simple thing. The effectiveness of a sword or a dagger as a cutting or slashing or hacking weapon depends on one thing, which is the length and the strength of the tang of the blade. The tang is, of course, this part. It is the part that enters the sheath. Yeah, it is the part that enters the handle. Because the stronger and thicker the tang, then the stronger the thrust of the weapon. If the tang is weak, then of course the weapon either snaps or the handle falls off. And one peculiar feature about the Keris, if you disassemble it, is that you will find that the tang is particularly short and weak. You'll see later, I have a 16th century Keris in my collection which has a tang that is no more than 1 inch long and no wider than 4 millimeters. Now, of course, what this means is that if I were to attempt to stab anyone with this, the likelihood is that the handle will fall off or the tang would snap, which would immediately render it useless as a weapon. And we know also from historical records that the Malays and Indonesians never fought with krises. They fought with swords, they fought with spears. Interestingly enough, axes were never used in Southeast Asia. There are no recorded instances of axes or hammers being used as weapons. Swords, machetes, parangs, of course, spears and javelins of all kinds, and of course from the 17th century onwards, guns. Sumatra was a major producer of guns, and when Malacca fell to the Portuguese in 1511, in the aftermath of the battle, the son of Alfonso de Albuquerque did an inventory and they found 8,000 guns among the Moluccans. Alfonso the younger noted that the guns produced in Malacca were as good as the guns being produced in Germany then in the 16th century. So that's how they fought. They fought with guns, they fought with swords and spears. They never fought with krises. So if you don't fight with a kris, what is the kris for? This has been a sort of little crusade of mine, because for the longest time I've been trying to convince Malaysians and Indonesians that the kris is not a weapon. It is a symbol of something else. It symbolizes something else. And what does it symbolize? Now, this is where it begins to get tricky, particularly in the context of post-colonial modern Malaysia and Indonesia, because if it doesn't function as a weapon, simply because it cannot be used as a weapon, and if it's meant to symbolize something, then what does it symbolize? Well, answering that question means going back to its history, going back to its early origins, and we get clues as to what it represents when we look at the object closer. Well, let's look at one feature of a kris which I think is quite unique to the object, which is this protrusion that you see at the front. Here. By the way, a kris, unlike any other weapon in Southeast Asia, has its own glossary, so to speak. It has names for its parts. It has a face, it has a back, it has a spine, it has a head, it has a bottom, like a human being. So this is its face, and that is its spine, that is its back. Now, when we look at the face of the kris, what do we have? We have that particular feature, and that feature is referred to today as the belalai gajah, the elephant's trunk. Now, again, if you look at the pantheon of Hindu cosmology, of course, we immediately identify the deity that is identified with the trunk, which is of course Ganesh. Then there are a few other features of the kris, which I shall elaborate later, that point to this object having very clearly a Hindu origin to it. But before that, I can skip these. These are just sketches of kris handles. And these are, well, here you have examples of the way in which the kris was then represented, recontextualized during the colonial context as this object that was identified with one community in particular, the Malay community, and was soon to be seen as, part and parcel of Malay ethnic identity. Now, here's a better look at a kris. This is a kris from North Malaysia, southern Thailand. It's of a distinctive type called kris Tajong, and it is only produced in North Malaysia and southern Thailand. And that's a closer look at its hilt, and I'll explain the hilt later. This is a distinctively South Thai kris. These are very tiny krises. These are called kris chotengs, and they have a very distinctive hilt as well, made of silver. That's actually wood inside. The silver is encased on top and hammered on top. This is a Malay kris, and again we see the same feature, the elephant's trunk, the trunk of Ganesh facing the front. Note, by the way, that I actually gave this analogy earlier, but I'll repeat it again. Despite the variations of style, there is actually no room for free play in the production of krises. The kris maker is in no position, is not allowed to simply invent a kris according to his own liking. There are specific set models of krises. So in the same way that a 3rd series BMW can't have a 5th series engine in it, or a 7th series BMW can't have a 5th series engine in it, likewise, you cannot simply invent a kris and say, I'll have 2 trunks instead, or I'll have, 5 curves instead of 7 curves. You can't. There is actually, there are set canons that determine the specification and make of each particular kris type. This is a North Malaysian one, and this is the one that you saw earlier with its sheath that is actually made from kemuning wood, which is Muraya paniculata jack, a sort of luminescent wood that has this chattiancy effect under the light. It gives an impression of depth. If you look at this in real life, those lines you see look like folds of a curtain. It actually has a 3-dimensional effect, has a chattiancy effect to it. Now, this is one of the earliest krises that I have. This is a 16th century kris from the late Mataram period. And this kris is interesting because it has this particular feature on its sheath, and that's another clue as to its origins. This feature here. That feature is commonly referred to as the third eye. The third eye of whom is left undiscussed and unspoken. But again, if we connect that to the trunk of Ganesh, then it's the third eye of Shiva. Except that again today, no one mentions the name of Shiva or Ganesh when they talk about the kris, simply because for politically correct reasons in the post-colonial age, it's simply taboo to mention their origins. But that feature makes the sheath complete. And this is a very early example of a Javanese kris, which later evolves to the one that you've brought here, for example. This is the precursor. This is how they look like. If you read Raffles' History of Java, you'll find illustrations of Javanese men wearing krises like these. And these are very rare these days. That's another look at it. And this is an interesting handle. It is again a handle of a choteng. You don't see any of the features. It's actually a 16th century kris handle, which was actually found in a river. And I'll explain to you why it was found in the river. But let's just backtrack a bit. Yes. Now, this is a contemporary piece of work done by my late teacher, the sadly departed Rashidin Nik Hussein, the last kris handle maker of Malaysia, who tragically died about a decade ago of cancer. He has 2 krises of note, one which hangs in the White House in Washington, and the other one in the collection of the Emperor of Japan. And unfortunately, during his time, despite the international recognition he received, in the Malaysian context, he was not all that welcomed by his peers and contemporaries, because he was producing kris hilts that clearly indicate the long history of the evolution of the kris going back to the Hindu era. This is one of his earliest works, and I'll show something that this is in fact his first Tajung hilt, and this is the work that he did during his apprentice days at the age of 23 in Bali. And Nik was unique in the sense that he was a devout Muslim from Kelantan who nonetheless felt a very strong connection to his pre-Islamic past and would not compromise in the production of these ivory and wood kris handles. He was literally the last of his generation, and after him, his younger brother continues to carve, but unfortunately, nowhere nearly as good as Nick's work. Nick only did 2 clearly Buddhist handles, this one and another one, and this one's in my collection. Another one, unfortunately, is owned by some woman in Singapore, and I don't know who she is, and I can't get my hands on it. But it is interesting for me because, as Veena might tell you, Kelantan is, of course, the state controlled by the Islamic Party of Malaysia, and Nick was a lonely woodcarver and ivory carver working in a small village by himself without any patronage or support by the state, and yet producing work of international quality like this, and sadly a lost voice in his own community, simply because of this strong adherence he had to his own tradition, to his past. So clearly, for me, the Hindu origins of the Keris seems to me patently obvious. When those Keris collectors and Keris scholars often raise the question of how and why the Keris came about. We do not know where the first Keris emerged. There is something which vaguely resembles a Keris in the repertoire of the royal paraphernalia of Cambodia. It is thought by some that the proto-Keris, so-called the Dong Song Keris, emerged in Cambodia made of bronze during the same period that Dong Song drums were being produced. If we look at the royal regalia of Java, Sumatra, and Malaysia, of course, the Keris is an essential part in the royal regalia of every single royal family. And if we look at the spread of the Keris, it is very clear that it emerges during a period when Keris production emerged in Java, when Java was at its height as a Javanese Hindu civilization. Keris production was initially confined to Java. It began in Java, and the producers of Keris, masters who we call pandai besi, basically ironsmiths, were of a certain caste. They had to be Brahmins. And the production of a Keris, interestingly enough, unlike other metal objects, unlike any other weapon, the production of a Keris had to be done in a special forge that was built in the form of a temple. And so, unlike other weapons that were used to fight or kill or defend, Keris production was something that was tightly controlled by a priestly caste who were Keris makers, specifically Keris makers, who made nothing else. This we know from courtly records that have been kept from the 12th century onwards. The rites and rituals that went into the production of a Keris were very elaborate, of course. There were fasting ceremonies that had to be, puja ceremonies had to be performed, fasting had to be undertaken normally for weeks or months. The production of a Keris would be a very ritual process and would be tailored to the person it was being made for. So depending on the social status and rank of the person, the production of a Keris might take anything between 2 weeks to maybe 6 months. And there is where the esoteric side of the Keris comes in, because the blending of the metals that went into making a Keris would depend a lot on the social rank, status, the social function of the person, and the person's age, character, background, etc., etc. You don't simply go to a shop and buy a Keris like you do these days. In those days, the Keris maker had to know you first. He had to know something of your personality. It is said that every person, every man would have 3 Kerises, one given to him by his father, one given to him by his father-in-law, and later one that he earns in the course of his life. And therefore, each Keris was very much a tailor-made object, very much like a tailor-made suit, except of course, they're highly, far more elaborate than going to a tailor in Savile Row. Now, Keris production, therefore, was something that was not taken lightly whereas normal weapons would be purchased anywhere. We know this even in the records of the first Portuguese and Spanish who came. Krises were very important ritual objects. In the museum, the ethnological museum in Leiden in Holland, there is one of the biggest collection of krises in the world, in fact, more than 12,000 in the basements, including the biggest collection of Balinese krises that came from the Balinese royal family. The reason why they're there is because in the last stages of the battle for Bali, when the Dutch conquered Bali, the Balinese royal families decided to commit puputan, which is ritual collective suicide. Rather than surrender to the Dutch, they dressed in their best, put on their ceremonial krises, and marched out before the Dutch guns and were shot to pieces. And the krises were then taken to the museum in Leiden. So the kris was literally the last thing you hold. It is actually, something that is very much personally, intimately linked to you. And if we look at the way in which the kris designs, we see the variations. Here's another interesting. Okay. If we look again, there we see the third eye of Shiva at the bottom. If we look at this hilt, the Hulu Choteng, and this hilt, the Hulu Tajong, the two hilts, this is another interesting connection to South Asia, I'm sorry. Today, in the contemporary context of Malaysia in particular, this particular hilt type is referred to as the kingfisher hilt. It's referred to as the kingfisher hilt. But upon closer inspection, and let's look at the drawing that I made. This is a drawing I made of a study of one of the earlier Tajong hilts. If we look closely, look at the details, some of which might be lost, but allow me to explain. If we look closely, what we see is a figure that clearly has a mouth, clearly definable eyes. He is wearing a crown. He has a beard, a nose or a beak. There are its wings, and the details are lost here because they are actually to the front. But what you see are two arms in this position, in a mudra, in a Dhyana mudra position. And what we don't really see here very clearly are two legs that are crouched in a position like that. Now, we are then told in Malaysia that this is a kingfisher. I've never in my entire life seen a kingfisher with two arms and two legs wearing a crown and a beard. But again, those who are familiar with Hindu cosmology will know that there is a semi-divine figure that corresponds to this, which is, of course, Garuda, the vehicle of Vishnu. And it is interesting to note that this particular type of hilt, the Tajong hilt, is found in North Malaysia and Southern Thailand, which is one part of Southeast Asia where the school of Hinduism that predominated was not Shivite Hinduism, but rather Vishnuite Hinduism. And why were these Hindus in southern Thailand and North Malaysia turning to Garuda as their symbol? It's because from the 12th to the 14th century, they were constantly being harassed by the expanding power of Majapahit, a Shivite Hindu empire. So what we had here basically was a conflict between Shivites and Vishnuites. And the Kelantanese and the Patani people of southern Thailand literally clung on to Garuda as their protector against the advancing forces of Shivite Majapahit. And yet, all of this history has been completely erased step by step by two important things. First, the coming of Islam, which in the early stages adapted itself to the realities of Hinduism and Buddhism in Southeast Asia, and secondly, perhaps even more devastating, the arrival of modern colonialism. which brings me to that hilt that I showed you earlier. Which is this one. This is actually a very, very old hilt. It may date back to the 16th century. The reason why it's in this condition is that it's been underwater for 300 years. It was actually found in the Kelantan River off Kota Baru. The base here is a cup of swasa, which is gold-copper alloy. And the nose is copper that's oxidized, but that base is actually gold. It has the appearance of copper, but it does not tarnish. And the reason why it was found in the bottom of a river is because by the 17th century, as Islam had arrived and more or less established itself across Southeast Asia, those who were collectors and owners of krises were caught in a dilemma. On the one hand, there was still this strong residual attachment and respect for this sacred object that had for the longest time been an emblem of their identity. But on the other hand, they also had to make certain compromises to the arrival of the new faith, and in particular the more Puritan variety that began to establish itself in Southeast Asia from the 17th century. It's interesting to note, for example, that from the 13th to the 17th century, with the coming of Islam, there was no problem with the kris. So even Muslim sultans and rajas were still wearing them. It's only from the 17th century onwards that we begin to see less appearance of the kris, simply because, I think, again, corresponding to what was happening in South Asia and in India, with the rise of conservative Islam in India, likewise, the same conservative current began to arrive to Southeast Asia from Sumatra, from Malaysia. And so what happened then, from the 17th century onwards, was the slow process of removal of the kris from the public domain. But because of its immense sacred power, unlike other objects that could be simply destroyed or thrown away or burnt, krises were not burnt, they were buried. And they were given ceremonial burials. And that's what happened to this one. It was wrapped, I assume, wrapped as they were often wrapped in yellow cloth and buried at the bottom of a river. It was found actually by a fisherman looking for shells to cook. It caught up in his net. And the blade had completely rotted away by then. The sheath was gone, but we managed to rescue this, the hilt. And this is actually one of the oldest Choteng hilts that we found. And it's a very rare hilt because it's actually in wood. You saw the earlier one that was completely encased in silver. This predates that by about 200 years. So the first thing that actually, the first impact on the kris, therefore, was this process of, having to somehow deny the very strong Hindu-Buddhist origins of the Malay communities of Southeast Asia with the coming of the new faith. Of course, then the second impact came with colonialism and the logic of colonial governmentality. One of the interesting things that happened, of course, with the colonization of Malaysia, particularly by the British, was that it instituted new social relations, the emergence of a new public domain based on contractual relations, the introduction of a very scientific, compartmentalized view of society, the use of the colonial census as a means to differentiate between ethnic groups. But it also invented something which had not existed before. It invented this thing called the Malay race through the use of the colonial census. It is interesting to note that from 1871, when the first colonial census was created, it was used every 10 years, 1871, 1881, 1891, all the way up to 1931. The colonial census began to reify the Malay race as a specific race with a specific racial identity. Now, I don't know about the languages of South Asia, but in the languages of Southeast Asia, the word race actually